All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Child Grand Rounds. We are super excited to be back together again in person. For those of you who are able to be here today, our first time in 3 years. So welcome, it's really good to be together again. It is my great pleasure and privilege to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Shawn Jones, and to welcome him home to UCLA. Dr. Jones earned his undergraduate degree at Duke, public health degree from Johns Hopkins, his PhD from UNC Chapel Hill. And then just to complicate his basketball loyalties, we lured him west to UCLA for internship. I'm going to pretend that there was like a little psychological crisis for you. He then went on to a postdoc at Penn before joining the faculty at Virginia Commonwealth University. Dr. Jones's scholarship focuses on risk and resilience factors for Black youth and families, with an eye toward understanding the mechanisms of action under these features and using that information to inform prevention and intervention efforts. We are so excited to have you with us today. And with that, I will turn it over. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, so much. I'm going to just make sure that I'm sharing my slide deck so that we're all good to go here in both spaces. Make sure we're good. Okay, great. All right, awesome. So again, thank you all so much for having me. Thank you so much for that gracious introduction. It is such an honor to, as you said, feel like I am coming home in a sense and having the opportunity to present as a part of Child Grand Rounds this morning. So I'm going to be speaking from the topic of this kind of tension that I see as important, not only for the research and training that I and my team, who I'll introduce a bit in a moment, have been doing, but also in a sense of the word, going to kind of be issuing a bit of reflection for us to maybe all consider. And so that is speaking from this kind of polarity between resilience and resistance with a focus on Black youth and family mental health. So let's kind of get into our discussion. And before we do so, it is important for me to always note that while I'm really gracious to be introduced in that way, it's important to recognize that the work that I do is not something that just emanates from an individual perspective. And so before we go any further, I would be remiss if I did not, in both the spirit of Ubuntu, so this idea that I am because we are, and Ujima, right, this perspective of collective work and responsibility, foreground by introducing the numerous individuals who I carry with me into the space this morning, my academic village, students, mentors, collaborators, who I not only share in this work with, but also kind of continue to push this work and me forward. So I want to recognize and bring them into the space with us this morning. Okay, so these are just the intended learning objectives, and given that we're a little bit behind time, I'm gonna just trust that we've seen those before, and if I don't nail it at the end, you all can hold me to account. So for our time today, what I endeavor to do over the next 45 minutes or so is to walk us through a little bit of this roadmap. So introducing a bit about the realities of racism for Black youth, something for whom we may have different levels of exposure and experience to. I want to then walk us through a racial mindfulness practice very briefly from some of my time at University of Pennsylvania as a part of a team that, again, I'll introduce. And then I want to spend the remainder of our discussion time really kind of making a case for the importance of racial ethnic protective factors when we're thinking about Black youth and family mental health, and particularly focusing on one of those constructs that has really been the focus of my own research, and that's racial socialization. And then, as I said at the outset, kind of ending with a little bit of a charge or a question in consideration for us as we think about seeing these issues collectively. So what I will ask you to do is to kind of take that roadmap in. And if you forget anything, just remember that there's a lot of C's. So just like C is for Cookie Monster, it's also for all of those things there as well. So let's buckle up and get into it. So I want to start by sharing a little bit of this narrative or these narratives that have been woven concerning both the historical and contemporary risk and realities of Black youth. And for some of you on this space, you may be familiar with these narratives, but if you allow me to kind of paint a picture a bit. So this narrative or these sets of narratives begin by pointing out to us that although both Black and white poverty fell as of 2019, there are more than a third of Black children who still live below the poverty line. These narratives surrounding Black youth continue on to remind us that Black preschool children's suspension rates, 48%, is more than 3 times their actual representation in those preschool classrooms, okay? Now, some of you all may be familiar with the important work of Walter Gilliam and colleagues out at Yale, who provide some insight using really kind of state-of-the-art eye tracking, right, research to maybe explain or provide some potential explanation as to what might be going on there. So really this idea that maybe there are some implicit biases, for example, that are causing folks in those settings to look particularly at Black boys and kind of surveil them in a way that might lead to that portion of the narrative. Moving on in development, right, these narratives also highlight for us that more than 90% of Black teenagers report that they have experienced discrimination. And some recent data by my colleague Devin English and others suggest that Black youth in this age range experience an average of 5 discriminatory events daily, right? Moving on, right? We also sometimes hear about the narrative concerning Black youth that they are often overrepresented in populations with high mental health needs. So in this particular image, we might, for example, be thinking about the juvenile justice system, but we also know that this narrative includes foster care system and other broader systems. And then yes, lest we forget, right, we must consider and really reflect on the realities of the so-called double pandemic, which was coined to help us understand how both COVID-19 and sustained racial animus, right, all can contribute to detrimental mental health outcomes for Black youth, okay? So these narratives, right, I argue, are important for us to be mindful of if we're not. And furthermore, I think that it's critical for us to understand that underlying these narratives, we're really talking about an understanding of racism in its multiple forms and how that shows up for Black youth as well as their families. So just by way of a bit of kind of terminology, reintroduction or introduction, right? I want to point out that Black youth are exposed to and experience a bevy of these forms of racism, right? So the individual prejudice, discriminatory events that many of us might be familiar with. There's some recent research, for example, that talks about kind of stopping and frisking behavior that happens for Black youth as young as 8. We also know that there are more subtle forms that show up as microaggressions. So for example, a potentially harmless compliment of speaking to how a Black youth or teenager sounds so articulate without maybe understanding what that might be connoting, right? This idea that you are outside of some stereotype, which would be that maybe Black youth are not expected to be such. Very common for this developmental time period are experiences of vicarious discrimination. So these are experiences that you might witness or hear about at the dinner table, about, your mother getting passed over for yet another promotion for some reason that you can't quite grasp, or your father or your uncle being pulled over, right? And that experience not going as well as one might hope. Moving on more broadly, we also know that racism shows up and impacts Black youth in the forms of institutional racism in terms of limited access to goods, services. We also see this even in the ways in which the institutions of voting, for example, and how redistricting impacts, right, policies and practices. We see this also in broader ways still, which some of us may be less familiar with, vis-a-vis cultural racism. So for example, we talk to youth sometimes and they're like, every time I turn on a TV or I watch something, why is it that Black people are presented in a particular light, in a stereotyped light? News stories are always depicting folks with mugshots and not how they lived, right? Even at the point of their death. These experiences also show up, right? And then the last one that has been a particular interest for me recently is really kind of thinking about notions of transgenerational transmission, as they are referred to. So you might refer to these as Nana stories, as grandmama stories, right? About how her own experiences, for example, navigating the realities of racism also are inherited and become a part of our own stories, or Black youth's own stories. So zooming in on this last piece a little bit, my colleagues and I have recently looked at some work through the lens of a perspective known as linked lives. And this is a public health perspective that argues, right, that we exist in relationship to one another. And so that experiences that I have for myself do not only impact me, but they're actually also connected to those with whom I am engaged in close interpersonal community. And so to kind of unpack this a bit, my colleagues and I recently tried to get a sense of what linked lives look like within Black families. And so in order to do that, we collected data on the experiences of parents and their teenagers, individual, institutional, and cultural racism experiences. So how much of these have you experienced in the past year? And so that's on the x-axis for our Zoom community, also on the x-axis. And then what we were able to see was that they were actually using latent profile analyses for kind of typologies of families that came out in our data. And want to make sure that I know that this was approximately 215 families that were a part of this analytic work. So looking first at the kind of bottom red line, we ended up kind of referring to this typology or this profile as low parent-teen racism. I'm not going to insult anyone's intelligence here. Got to see that if we look at where they are, looking at the y-axis, which is standardized mean scores, that we might agree that relative to the other three profiles, they're endorsing lower experiences of both parent and teen racism. Our second profile that represented about 35% or so of our sample were these families that we ended up referring to as kind of moderate parent-teen racism. Again, not much to kind of unpack there, really just kind of looking at a combination of the raw and standardized mean scores. I want to really draw our attention to the last two perspectives. So one was this kind of green line here, about 18% of our sample, that were moderate high parent and low teen racism. So again, thinking about that notion of Nana stories, these are parents who are endorsing relatively high experiences of all three forms of racism, again, relative to most of their parenting peers. but are also raising and parenting teenagers who are not really endorsing a ton of particularly individual and institutional experiences with slightly more experiences of cultural racism. I'll return to those folks in a minute after introducing this last kind of small but mighty and important profile, which we refer to as our high parent-teen racism, as you can see. So you might be saying, okay, well, what is the point of showing this? Why does this matter? So what we found in this work is that these profiles were associated not only with the ways in which these Black families and youth communicated about the meaning and significance of race, which I'll come back and talk about in a bit, but also we see that the levels of endorsement of stress, depressive and anxiety symptoms, right, for both youth and parents were elevated in both the high parent-teen and the moderate high parent low teen racism profiles. So again, to say and suggest to us that something about kind of being in a household where you're constantly exposed to racism has implications for, yes, how we're going to talk about those realities, and also our family's mental health and well-being. Okay, so I have introduced racism in its multiple forms. I also want to make sure that we recognize the ecological systemic realities and reach of racism. So for youth, right, racism shows up in a variety of contexts and settings, right? So we see that in school context at a variety of levels, including policies. So one of the things that I often unfortunately refer to is kind of a high profile case that came out of a high schooler who was on a wrestling team and was made to cut his hair. Right, he was wearing a dreadlocked hairstyle, and in the match was actually had to cut his hair before continuing to engage in the match, which he did. Right, so thinking about policies that show up and disproportionately impact youth in these settings, of course, in our neighborhood settings, and I've already referred to some of those experiences. And then also, and particularly relevant in the era of Gen Z and beyond, is the far reach of social media. So work by my colleague Rendisha Tynes and others suggest that there is increased online victimization of Black youth, both direct and vicarious. So seeing your peers who are also Black being talked about in a denigrating way. We also know that there are policies and practices on some of these sites vis-a-vis autoplay videos that, whether you like it or not, give you a front row seat into Black death and degradation, right, which can have a deleterious impact on youth mental health. And again, looking at cultural forms, we see things such as cultural erasure. So again, sometimes when I talk about this, folks are like, huh? But this is real. So on TikTok, for example, there is a really interesting issue wherein oftentimes Black youth and Black youth who live in intersections, Black women, Black queer folk, who are often drivers of content creation and trends, right, are somehow deplatformed or their existence is erased, so that now when you see this phenomenon, right, it's not attributed to the folks who were originally the creators of that. And again, that might seem like a trivial perspective, but all of these things we know add up to express in how concerning, again, these narratives are. So when I really think about the state and importance of, right, the reach of racism for Black youth, I think about two particular perspectives. So one of them, I invite us to peruse from my colleague, Dr. Rihanna Anderson, at the University of Michigan, who in a recent paper drew a connection between racism and kind of the development and transmission of a virus. I invite you to read this paper, very thought-provoking. But one of the things that Dr. Anderson argues here is that in ways, these narratives that we're talking about, right, kind of become this background violin music, or in her parlance, kind of become woven and passed on into our social DNA, into the fabric of our society, so that it becomes kind of just the way things are. And that's kind of bad, not ideal, but here we are. And that replicates across generation. The other particularly clinically relevant issue is that it's not enough for me to speak to the 90% of folks who endorse an experience of discrimination. But what we know, and what is more concerning, is that for a subset of these youth, they are experiencing racial stress and trauma, right? So these moments where those experiences tax their ability to cope begin to resemble in many ways symptom profiles that we might expect to see in PTSD, for example, re-experiencing arousal, right? And so thinking about how can we really wrap our heads around the fact that these are not just stories that are happening, right? But these are traumatic realities that are impinging upon the ability, as my pen suggests here, right, for Black folks to have joy and to be magical and to thrive through a psychosocial health lens and framework. Okay. Cool. So for me, it's important that we not just bear witness to these narratives, but I'm gonna actually, and it's gonna be confidential and uncomfortable, but I'm gonna invite us actually to courageously reflect, so that we're not just bearing witness, but we're bearing witness to these narratives. So I'm gonna invite everyone in this space. You can pull out your phone if you would. I'm gonna ask you to spend just 1 minute reflecting on the following, okay? The phone is for the next step, but you can also jot down your reflections here as well if you'd like to. All right, so that prompt is the following. I would like you to reflect on a time that you were impacted by racism, or reflect on the first time you felt different due to your race. I'm gonna start that timer now over here, and I invite you to just silently reflect. Okay. Now, what I would like to invite you to do next is to, using your mobile device, share anything you noticed while you were reflecting. Any thoughts, any feelings, any bodily reactions. You can do so by scanning this QR code here, or if you are either in our virtual community or on your phone and QR code doesn't work using your camera, you can go into your internet browser and type in slido.com, slido.com, and just put in hashtag SEMEL, SEMEL, and you should be able to join us in sharing. And again, this is not gonna come like with your name attached. And I invite you, if you have multiple things that you noticed, you can do multiple entries. Okay, I am gonna, please don't feel like you need to stop typing. I can see like there are still like 12 people typing or so. I'm gonna just start to show what our kind of community cloud, word cloud is kind of looking like and see what we see here, and hopefully, here we go. All right, so I invite us all to just kind of zoom back and take a moment and kind of see what our hybrid community is endorsing in the space this morning. Okay, so sadness is jumping out to us perhaps in this word cloud. Also see tense and anger jumping out. Also seeing discomfort and anxiety and helplessness. And let's see what else. And I invite you all also to again notice what you're seeing: otherness, beauty. I see something that looks like maybe a number of different sentences that or a number of different words that maybe make a sentence, right? So this is really great, and I appreciate you all for kind of courageously sharing in this space. So you may be wondering now, like, well, what is the point of that reflection, and what is the point of kind of seeing what comes up for us? And so again, as I said, I think it's critical for us, particularly those of us who are engaging in clinical work, perhaps with Black youth and families who may be navigating this, to again, in the spirit of kind of witness, to think about how it feels to have to reflect, to navigate, to wade through, right, these experiences. And so I'm actually going to introduce for us briefly, and I'm going to do my own reflection to be fair and not hypocritical. But I want to introduce to us a particular strategy that I and a number of my colleagues have employed over the last several years. And that is this idea of racial mindfulness. Anyone familiar with racial mindfulness at all? Okay, something new. Great. I'm glad I'm able to bring something into the space. So, racial mindfulness, just to quickly talk about what that is our ability, right, in moments to take a step back and recognize that when we are experiencing otherness, racism, as we're talking about here, on whatever side we're on, that these are experiences that have the potential to be stressful often. And so this practice of racial mindfulness allows us to both read and recognize how we and others might be feeling in these tense, sad, anger-invoking moments, right? To kind of check in with self so that we can also check in with others. So the way that my mentor, Dr. Howard Stevenson, myself and other scholars that are part of University of Pennsylvania's Racial Empowerment Collaborative think about this idea of racial mindfulness is through this acronym CLCBE, okay? And so what we do in clinical spaces, I bring them into these spaces, even though it seems probably a little bit different than your typical, maybe grand rounds conversation or discourse, is right to invite us to check in with ourselves about these sorts of moments. And we do that by, right, first calculating. So calculating, meaning naming, right, the feelings, putting a label to the feelings that you're experiencing or that youth are experiencing, right? And asking them to name these feelings and then to rate the intensity of these feelings on a scale from 1 to 10, right? So 1, right, not being a very big deal, 10 being a very, very intense endorsement of this experience, oftentimes maybe feeling as though that is an overwhelming, right, amount of whatever the emotions are. So for myself in my reflection, I might think back to when I was young and in a grocery store with my mother, and a woman kind of swept me to the side because I was like excited about grabbing chips and candy, which tracks for me, right? And as she pushed past us, she instructed my mother to get her little racial epithet out of the way. So when I think about that experience, right, I think about sadness in those moments. And I think about even reflecting on it now, probably being sad at a 5 or 6. And that occurred 30 years ago, right, for me. And so we invite folks to think about what does that mean? What does it mean if I accidentally, and unwittingly engaged in a microaggression? How am I feeling? Am I feeling really guilty? Am I feeling embarrassed? Right? No matter where we find ourselves in racially tense moments, we want to invite ourselves to calculate that. The second step in CLCBE, right, that we often engage in as a part of this practice is then to next locate this, right? So speaking with family, so we're good here, came home. So we know the importance, right, of connection, right, to where physiologically we might be carrying these experiences. So we invite youth, we invite folks like yourselves to really get specific in that, right? So it's one thing to say like, oh, like, where do you feel it? And for me to say, yeah, I kind of feel it in my throat a little bit, right? It's more specific to say that as I stand here in front of you all, reflecting on that I feel like the inside of my throat has suddenly turned into the Sahara Desert, and I feel like it's that dry that if I don't immediately take a sip of this water, I'm afraid I won't be able to continue on, right? That is how we invite folks to locate how these experiences land. As a third experience, the second C in CLCBE is to communicate. So oftentimes, right, we're inviting folks to think about any words or images that come to mind, being mindful of one's self-talk. So to demonstrate that, I will say for me right now, as I'm standing here and reflecting, the self-talk that's coming up for me is, wow, what would I do if that happened today? Wow, I wonder if that lady realized like that I would be standing up here 30 years later talking about that incident. Probably not, maybe not, I don't know, right? Though that's the internal dialogue that I am kind of playing in my mind at this moment. And then finally, and importantly, right, and I just caught myself doing it, right? We invite youth, we invite ourselves, and I'm going to invite you all with me before we continue on, to forget or to remind ourselves to breathe, right? Oftentimes in these moments that are racially tense, we forget to breathe. Oftentimes when we check in with folks, they're like, sit here, right, like this, understandably. But, right, or and rather, we recognize the importance of right, returning breath to our body in these moments. So I am going to do and invite everyone here and also in our Zoom community, as you feel comfortable, to just, this is child grand rounds, right? So let's do a good rose candle. Can we do a good rose candle? Okay, so on the count of three, we're all going to inhale the rose and then blow out the candle. Okay, so 1, 2, 3. And exhaling. All right, great. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. So again, you know, may be wondering why we do that, right? But again, my hope and explaining that is to connect these narratives that we talked about with folks like lived and felt realities and what they're either carrying and willing to share in spaces or still carrying even if they're unwilling to share in certain spaces. But it also, right, brings to mind for us the realities of then what do we do about this, right? And so returning back to this graphic for a while, for a second here, I, in my own work, often think about Black youth well-being at the center. So helpful graphic for me. And I also think about, okay, well, what can we do here and who can help do things? Who has a role to play here? And so a lot of the research that I and my team conduct is really saying, okay, well, let's look at the role of the family. Let's look at parents, let's look at extended family, which is often a critical component in many Black communities across the diaspora, the role of extended fictive kin. So that's a lot of what, right, our work does. Then in my clinical hat, I look into broader circles and I say, oh, wait a minute. We're also here too in physical and mental health systems. And so I think about, okay, well, how can we, right, think about supporting Black youth and the realities of this? And so in doing so, right, a lot of the work that I would argue that, you know, I'm going to be sharing for us in the remainder of our time has really focused on saying, okay, how can we help Black youth who experience racism in its multiple forms? How can we help them be resilient? And I know it may be strange, it is not a typo, but that does say resilience ecologically defined. And that is for a moment intentional, right? I want us to look at this definition of the ability for a system to recover from a disturbance and return to its pre-disturbed state, okay? So when I think about the work that is important, part of the work that's important for us to do, and really being concerned with Black youth and adolescent mental health, I think about resilience. And as I think about resilience in particular, I think about that definition and say, okay, well, how can we cultivate resilience? And in cultivating that resilience and adopting that particular ecological definition of the term, right? I think about in that way, how do we assist Black youth, right, with bouncing back? How do we help Black youth bounce back when they experience these types of racism-related stressors in their multiple forms? And so as I think about that, still a psychologist, right? I'm called to, for example, a psychological perspective on the matter offered by Sanaya Luthar and colleagues, which really talks about dynamic processes that lead to positive adaptation for these youth, even in the face of significant adversity. And so it's through that lens, right, that the work that we do really seeks to make a case for the importance of racial, ethnic, protective, and promotive factors. So protective, right, meaning buffering against the nefarious, associations that we see often with racism and health. And then also promotive of really thinking about, okay, well, how are particular these factors helpful, even when maybe I'm not experiencing a lot of racism, but just kind of help me again to kind of cultivate or live in wellness or even flourish and not just live outside of stress and sadness and anxiety, right, in these moments. And so within that framework, three and critical, right, factors that my work and others really interrogates are the following. So ethnic racial socialization. You may remember when I talked about the linked lives and I said that those last two profiles were really associated with ways in which families talked about the realities of race and racism. That is another word for ethnic racial socialization. We also know that critical to the resilience of Black youth is their development of a healthy sense of ethnic racial identity. So what is the significance? What is the meaning of their Blackness? Do they see it as a detriment? Do they see it as joy? Do they see it as both? What does that mean? How does that matter for how they should show up in those various ecological settings? And then also, right, cultural orientation or worldview. So how do we contend with a set of values or realities more broadly about how we engage within our world? Okay, so again, all of these factors are associated with positive youth outcomes. And so that's great news, right? Self-esteem, academic engagement, attenuated mental health symptomology, right? As Dr. Paris noted, and as Dr. Luthar's definition calls us to, it's critical for us then to think about, right, how do we move from, or how do we consider moving from factors to processes? So again, if we know that this is this kind of well-defined and deleterious link, and we know that these factors are critical in promoting resilience, right? Then an attention to mechanism asks us, okay, well, how do those factors, right, lead to, again, relatively better mental health outcomes? And so this is a model developed initially by Dr. Enrique Neblett and colleagues, which speaks to three critical mechanisms that have been hypothesized, and in some of our work further kind of tested to say, okay, well, how do these factors, right, what are the processes? And so what we are intending and increasingly finding is that in some ways, things like a healthy racial identity and healthy racial socialization messages help Black youth simply have a greater sense of self, right? A greater self-concept, greater self-esteem, greater both general self-efficacy, but also racial self-efficacy. So meaning that when I encounter these experiences, do I feel that I can come out of those experiences in a way that centers and protects my mental health? Another critical mechanism, right, that some of our work undertaken is really looking at attribution. So thinking about Lazarus and Folkman's stress and coping frameworks of really, how do I appraise these realities? How do I meaning make? How do I make sense of someone clutching their purse when I get on the elevator, right? And how do I internalize that? Do I externalize that, right? And really getting some kind of further concretization on how that can support healthy mental health. And then third and lastly, our work is really identifying both general and culturally specific coping strategies that these three racial ethnic protective factors bring about. So, really thinking about things like problem-focused methods of coping, and also honoring things like spiritual practice, honoring things like advocacy and activism as a form of coping, critical consciousness raising as a form of meaning making, and then eventual coping as well, all as strategies that help to improve the mental health of Black youth. So, seeing where my time is at, and I want to make sure I leave time for us to engage in some questions and comments. So, what I'm going to do is going to jump a little bit through some of this presentation, but I want to really highlight a couple of things about socialization, and then I will leave us with a moment of reflection. Actually, I'm not going to do that. I am going to change my mind. What I'm going to do, because there can't have Q&A, this ends at 10. So what I'm going to do actually is I am going to invite us to really reflect on a second part of this coin. And so the second part of the coin that I'm going to invite us to reflect on, and yes, you're about to see a lot of slides, but we're going to just make up time in the air, is the following. So I'm going to essentially move through. All right. So the last bit of my work over the last really year or so, or 2 years, I would say probably more earnestly, has really led to an epiphany of sorts for me. And I would be remiss if I didn't bring it into this space. So I shared and talked about the mechanisms that exist and what our research is finding about things like socialization and how it's protective. And what you didn't see on that slide, but spoiler alert, is that we know that healthy racial socialization, for example, really is helpful not only for Black youth, but we're finding that it's also important for the whole Black family and curative in that way, because it allows Black adults who maybe had experiences in childhood and are having experiences now to process those things. And we're doing that in some ways that are connecting to intervention work. So that's in one breath fantastic. And I hope that you all don't think that I am anti-resilience work, especially because that's how I was just introduced. But this is a reality too, right? Is this question that is begged, right? Do Black youth deserve better than resilience? And so I'm gonna again introduce an ecological definition, this time of resistance. I found this really interesting when I was posed this question and then began to really reflect on it, which is, if we look at resistance through an ecological framework, it's defined here as an ability for a system to remain unchanged when being subjected to a disturbance. So the idea or the mindset of resilience is that this toxic agent comes in, we absorb it, and we bounce back. Resistance might argue, right? Well, what happens if we as a system prevent the toxicity in the first place? Like, what if we don't have to absorb it and then require youth to bounce back from it? And so if we move from an idea of cultivating resilience to a framework of creating resistance, and that's us again, right? Then we move from a framework of bouncing back or requiring Black youth to bounce back to us and our systems of influence pushing back against those narratives of racism. We bring the child into greater focus right? Rather than them shrinking momentarily, and yes, they're gonna like pop back, we say, well, wait, what if we set up and think in our systems how we can push back against racism in its multiple forms so that our children, our Black youth don't have to shrink, even if it's momentarily, but they actually grow, right? And so really our call and our invitation is for myself. I'm not being a hypocrite. I'm navigating it through it as well. That's why I thought I could come home and talk about this. Is what does, and that says collective resistance from racism look like? In familial processes, in school processes, in our neighborhoods, in our community processes, right? A good colleague of mine, and I invite you, name is Dr. Nkemka Anyuwo, recently released a blog that was a follow-up to an empirical article talking about raising Black children to resist. And I called Dr. Anyuwo, and I was really proud of her, a mentee of mine. And again, this was, as you can see, raising Black children to resist. So where I'm gonna leave us at is, you can just reflect in the interest of time. But I want us to really think about this. What does it look like here? What does it look like in the care that we provide, in our systems? Clinically, what does it look like for us to resist racism in our research, in our clinical work, in our teaching, right? So that, again, we are not requiring Black youth to continue to contort themselves, right, to survive and hope to thrive, but we can, as my other button says, right, help fight against, right, oppressive forces, right? Racism is a system, so why are we requiring individuals, in particular Black youth, right, to have an individual reaction to a systemic issue? So I will leave us here, child and adolescent psychiatry grand rounds, to reflect on how we can resist. How can we resist in our multiple settings, okay? So I am going to, on a final note, invite us to think about one more reality, and then I'll take a couple of questions. So why, again, is this work critical, and why, importantly, is what I'm going to ask us to do one more time, which is to breathe before we leave this space and go back to fighting, to meeting, to holding witness with patients, clients, others. Why is this work critical, and why is it important, again, before you leave, soon folks too, that we're going to breathe? I'm going to invite you to just listen to this and let it kind of resonate and land for you, right? Oh, or not. Let's try that one more time. Let's see.
In a time when our breath is being intentionally snuffed out, deliberate and deep breathing is an active form of resistance.
So I've called us to think about resistance systemically, but again, I know that you all have to lace up where you're at and your location, your locale, your local context. And so I invite us all, as we get ready to respond to that, to reflect to that call, to take one more deep breath, to take us out of this space. So again, come on, we're gonna do it on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay, and exhale. Okay. Good job. Again, I hope that you take that charge seriously. I know that I will. I want to thank you all so much for your time. I apologize that we ran out of a bit of time. I'm happy to stay back and answer any additional questions. Thank you again for having me. And it's good to be back home. This was my cohort from 2015, 2016. So thank you all so much.
We will invite those of you who can stay for questions to stick around. I'm going to start with one though.
Yes.
Your work and your great talk today has really emphasized the importance of healthy racial socialization and
Yes.
how protective that is for kids. And
Yeah.
I'm wondering, in a clinical setting,
Mhm.
what strategies do you use with Black families to help them build those skills?
Absolutely. It's a great question. So I'm going to try to answer it really, really quickly. It's a really good question. And I think it's really important because coming out of the summer of 2020, you had a lot of families say like, well, what do I tell my kids? Right? What do I say? And there's a part of that, right, that is critical. Like, how do I support them? How do I not rob them of their innocence, but also prepare them for the bias that they may experience? How do I undergird and affirm their humanity and their dignity? That is critically important. How do I do so in a developmentally appropriate way is critically important. The other thing, though, that we do in our work with Black families is also to really recognize that it does us no good to really focus on what exactly we say if we are not feeling agentic, if we're not feeling competent in our ability to do so. So we have a lot of Black families who, when we talk to them, like, yeah, those are the things we would suggest that you say too. But what we find is that a lot of Black families are very, very stressed at the thought of having this conversation. They are frozen to the point of not having the conversation. They don't think they need to have the conversation until their children are teenagers, when we know that children are making sense of their racialized worlds way earlier than that. So a lot of the work, the charge that we have is to say, you have already some of the keys and tools for saying it. You also know your child, right, better than these outside researchers do, and even a clinician who's in a space with them for, in my context, 50 minutes, right? We really want to support you in feeling competent, feeling confident, feeling like you have the tools. So if those are resources, if those are short videos, right? And also helping you to check in with your stress, with your frustration, with your own anger. Why do I have to have these same conversations that my parents were having with me? So that's a lot of the work that we're doing to support, is really thinking about this idea of not just the content of racial socialization, but also helping families feel more competent in being able to have these tough and important conversations. Yes.
What parents were telling their kids in the moderate high, where the parents were experiencing stress, but the kids weren't experiencing as much versus the other parents. What was the difference in what they were?
So I think that, yes, the answer is yes. So the difference is that there was a lot more of what we call preparation for bias messages. So basically, what I didn't get to show you, but go back a couple of weeks ago, if you watched the State of the Union, President Biden actually gave the nation a little bit of the talk, as it's called. Put your hands on 10 and 2 when you get pulled over. Don't reach, don't do any sudden movements. So we saw that there were differences in the delivery of those types of messages, which is not actually inherently a bad thing. In fact, the research suggests that a combination of preparation for bias and also distilling pride that, yes, you may have to do these things, but it's not because you're less than. You are beautiful. You are amazing. Your Blackness is beautiful. Your hair texture is beautiful. Your skin tone is beautiful, right? That combination actually is an ideal set of messages for Black youth to receive. So we found that there were more of those messages. We also found that there were slightly more of maybe I consider a more problematic set of messages, which is called promotion of mistrust, which is this kind of broad brush painting of like, just stay away from others, because that's how I'm kind of delivering my protection, is just by telling you to just stay away. Just don't even hang around with, use an example with our Black families, don't hang around with white people. They don't mean you any good, right? We can understand in our increasingly diverse and globalized society how that may A, not be feasible, but B, not be the most ideal set of messages, even if we can understand them. So I think the takeaway from that work, that profile work, is mixed in that, right, at a point of thinking about kind of, well, what does intervention with those families look like? So it looks like helping a little bit of framing the kind of content and what we know about that, a little bit of psycho-ed, if you will. But it also looks like some holding space and processing, because a lot of those parents, because of their own experiences, right, they're forgetting developmental appropriateness of these things. So I'm like, okay, how old is your child? Okay, you're gonna tell your child 10 and 2 and they're 3? Like, well, right. And so I think that's the other part, is really holding space for recognizing that Black families are required to have these conversations. And they're also still like living the realities of why they're required to have these conversations. So holding space, and a lot of the work that we're looking toward in our upcoming intervention work is actually holding space explicitly for parents and caregivers of Black youth to be able to process their own thing, the kind of common refrain of putting your mask on first. And finding that sort of holding space, we're seeing reports, and even just kind of brief therapeutic interviewing is being received as like, ooh, this is a weight off my shoulders. I feel better able to have these conversations now that I've processed some of my own hurts, harms, stress, trauma. So a bit long-winded, sorry, but I hope that answers your question.
You're just getting compliments.
Oh, thank you all so much. I appreciate it.
Cheryl, did you?
Yeah, I mean, I keep hearing in my mind what I've been hearing in the media, and particularly in these last few weeks of, there's no systemic racism, and we're, anybody who tries to, I mean, I cannot even imagine how those messages complicate or just burden the work that you have to do as a parent, the work that you have to do as a clinician. I don't have anything I don't really have a question other than to say like, it's just, part of it is how do you deal with your own reaction to those situations when you're trying to do this very clear and informed work.
Yeah, I appreciate that reflection. A quick thought is, one thing is that I found helpful and instructive is to recognize that even those messages, if we think about what socialization is, take the racial part off of it for a second, then we know that those messages are also socializing. Because if there is no systemic racism, then perhaps if an incident happened, you're overreacting, or maybe you just didn't work hard enough, or maybe you didn't deserve that thing, or there's a lot more of a chance and opportunity for, again, youth, which is my focus, right, to not be able to kind of externalize that and perhaps internalize that, or what we call appropriated racial oppression of like, this is all brought upon by who I am and myself and deficiency. So I think it's critical to recognize that those messages also socialize. They just, in my opinion, don't socialize in ways that are going to be optimally healthy for Black youth. Right. I appreciate you sharing that. Yeah, I just
think about what it must be like.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I appreciate you naming that. I was in Florida 2 weeks ago, and some of those conversations did come up in the space. And yeah, it's tough because, again, it's tough it's infuriating. I think the other thing that I recognize in terms of thinking about resistance is like, we have to be like systemically savvy. So like, okay, right? So if people are saying we can't talk about those things, well, what is another entryway that we still like affirm, the realities that folks are experiencing, that we don't deny, dehumanize those experiences, and to find like language and to find retorts and responses to when folks kind of name those things. Not saying it's easy work, and I'm saying it's nevertheless important for us to figure out. That's why I wanted to end where I wanted to end, because if not, again, the burden just goes back to those Black youth and their families, and they've been doing it kudos, right? And like, can we reimagine a way where we talk back to those narratives, that we make it so that someone's coming in here, I'm not going to say next year because I'm a realist, but at a time in the future, and they don't have to start with that little circular narrative thing, or maybe parts of that are improved, right? And so, yeah, just kind of responding to your response. Appreciate that.
Hi, so thank you for the talk. Wondering, thinking in terms of their model of like individual
Mhm.
racism, and then like thinking of systemic issue or pushing against it, how can academic spaces and training spaces,
Mhm.
what can we do here at UCLA
Mhm.
to implement that?
So I don't want to speak out of turn because I want to make sure that some of the things may already be being done. So these are suggestions that may be already implemented. I think it's important to really understand and find language to name what a system of oppression look like, and to make it real to our context. I think that's the other thing that's sometimes difficult is, so for example, I'm coming to you all from Virginia. So it's not sometimes hard for me to have that conversation when, we had the Confederate statues like in our backyard. But sometimes it may be difficult in your own personal, relative ecological spaces for it to land. So finding like, well, what does this look like here? Let's name that here. So yeah, okay, great. Maybe we don't have to contend with these symbols of oppression, but maybe in the way that we privilege, again, I'm not trying to cast aspersions, like who stands at these podiums. Maybe that's something that we can look into, like what do our Thursday morning spaces look like? So I think those are ways in our academic and our training spaces, for example, that we can look at that. What sorts of even models of healing are introduced, are privileged, are known, are accessible for us to try out and try on in these spaces, right? Many of these I'll speak for myself, which is not a reflection here, predates here. Some of these, a lot of these things I had to learn and go elsewhere to get exposure to thinking about other ways that were strengths focused, that were not deficit oriented in terms of healing for Black youth and thinking about their collective mental health and well-being. So why is that the case? Why are there not more models that are accessible, that are being integrated into the training experiences, even before people even come to an internship space or a medical school space? So I think those are ways that we can think about within this sphere of influence, like how we can. So recognizing, right? Recognizing, understanding, like what is the climate and the landscape here, and then how do we respond to that? How do we modify? How do we adjust? And so, yeah, I appreciate that. I actually would tell a quick story. I was here 7 years ago, and I don't know if you remember this, but you remember this, probably do. I forgot exactly how it happened. Okay, yes, you do. There was a grand rounds, and I was like, wait, but what about this? And I'm part of the reason I'm here and will always come back is folks listened in this space who had power. They then allowed me the opportunity to share with colleagues and with other folks during our didactic experiences, talking about what racism in its multiple forms looks like, all in response to like just being like, wait a minute, can we think about this differently? The opportunity, like those sorts of intentional moments matter for us to again push back, for us to again kind of move forward in a collective fashion. So.
Thank you so much, Shawn. Really, really grateful to have you here. And I know you have a series of meetings throughout the day, but we'll probably be picking your brain for other resources and things to build on this really
Yes.
valuable work.
Yes, I'll be happy to share. I have a set of resources, including the racial mindfulness tool that I'll be happy to share for dissemination. So thank you all so much for your time. I appreciate it.